Welcome to The Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast from Blick, Rothenberg, the tax, accounting and business advisory firm. This week, a spring statement special with Nimesh, Shah and Heather Self.
Welcome to The Tax Factor, the UK's top tax podcast. I'm Nimesh Shah, CEO of Blick, Rothenberg.
And I'm Heather Self. It's our spring statement special, coming to you a day early and hot off the press following the Chancellor's statement.
So, Heather, the spring statement, what an underwhelming event. And that's all we've got time for on today's Tax Factor. I'm Nimesh Shah. I'll see you next week.
That's The Tax Factor.
Of course, that's not going to be the case. What did happen in this spring statement? Because really, Heather, it all kicked off last autumn, actually probably even a bit before then, because we had this wild speculation about what might happen in Rachel Reeves' first budget in the autumn statement when I happened to be conveniently on holiday. But my holiday is long gone and a lot's happened since the autumn budget. In this spring statement, she didn't really touch on too much in the way of taxes or what has just come before us. But what are your thoughts on the spring statement? Was it a missed opportunity as well?
Well, it definitely wasn't a budget, and there weren't any tax rises just to put everybody out of their misery. This was all about fiscal fine-tuning, as Paul Johnson of the IFS put it. Rachel Reeves made a big thing about hitting her fiscal targets. They're non-negotiable. She's got to make sure that current account spending is matched by tax receipts by the end of this Parliament. And to get to that, she made some really quite small tweaks to a number of her assumptions. But there was nothing radical at all and nothing really strategic about it. I think it's my biggest disappointment with her so far. I'm not getting any sense of vision for the tax system.
I actually thought she started the spring statement speech quite confidently, and at one point during the statement at the early junctures, I thought, actually, this feels and sounds like more of a budget. But as time went on, it was clear that she was going back on where the country's finances were. There wasn't going to be any major tax announcement or major spending pledges. So in a way, that was a good thing, because she stuck to her promise of one fiscal event, and that definitely wasn't today's spring statement. But I did think it was a missed opportunity, because the country has been begging Rachel Reeves, especially around the national insurance rise that's about to happen next week. And I did think to myself, what would have happened? Imagine the reaction from the public, Heather, if she stood up today and said, I've heard you, and I'm going to cancel that national insurance increase. That was never going to happen. The country's finances weren't going to be able to absorb that. But I don't think she quite estimates the impact of that national insurance rise and the anchor that's going to cause on businesses and the planning that's going in from businesses right now to try and absorb that increase on their employment tax bill.
It's a really big cost for businesses, and in particular because she's lowered the threshold at which employers' national insurance kicks in, it's particularly going to hit those who've got part-time workers or lower paid workers. I'm seeing, just from my own experience as trustee of a charity, it's really hitting us hard. And I think for a lot of businesses, it's a very unwelcome tax rise, which is still happening from the 1st of April. And there's a few other things which you mentioned in the budget last year, which of course are going to hit from the 1st of April. SDLT is going up. The reductions for first-time buyers and the temporary increase in the threshold have gone. So anybody moving house, that is going to cost them more money. The non-dom changes, which we've talked about a number of times, are still going to come in. And she hasn't bowed to all the pressure on inheritance tax for farmers. So farmers are still not going to be happy. So there's nobody going to be thrilled.
Yeah, and actually I can add a bit more to it as well. I was thinking, again, this morning in anticipation of the spring statement, we're not going to see too much. That was pretty much nailed on. But other things that I suppose are landing on businesses, the national minimum wage increase, business rates are increasing as well. Capital gains tax did increase at the autumn budget, but there's a bit more change to business asset disposal relief from this April, and private equity rules are changing, and some small things like the furnished holiday let regime. All these things are kind of in the background now 6 months ago, and other world events have kind of taken over. It doesn't take away from the fact that the economy is struggling. At the start of the speech, she talked about the growth forecast from the OBR for 2025 being halved to just 1%. And I think we're going to get to a point later on this year, and we'll come on to that maybe in a moment, but the country is going to run out of money because that economic growth is lagging within the system. But there was, though, some bits of tax detail that we can maybe pick up on, and possibly some good news, because you spotted a consultation about an advanced clearance process for major infrastructure projects. That sounded quite interesting, Heather.
I think this is good news. It's not a huge step and it's not going to affect the vast majority of taxpayers. One of the big grumbles from big business in particular is the lack of certainty. If a business wants to do a major infrastructure project, such as building a new power station or a new airport or something, it really wants to know what the tax consequences are going to be. And at the moment, the process for getting clearance is quite cumbersome and it doesn't always apply. If you've got something which is not a major change in the legislation, it can be quite difficult to persuade HMRC that they ought to give you clearance on it. When I was working at a previous firm, we had clients who were really exercised about the question over whether subsea cables were plant or fixtures, and it really made a difference to the economics of a very big project. So I think this idea of having a specific process to give more certainty is a good one, but it's only going to apply to the biggest infrastructure projects. They're talking tens of projects a year, not hundreds. My hope is that if this can be done and if it can work well, then perhaps they might extend it more generally, because one interesting bit in the detail, they are considering charging people for these clearances on the basis that if it's going to help the project, then perhaps the taxpayer should pay the extra HMRC costs because they'll need to recruit additional specialists to do it. That's the first time they've talked about charging for clearances. I really don't see why they shouldn't. And I wonder whether we might start to see that spreading more widely, that if other businesses want certainty, they could pay to get it.
Yeah, and I wonder if this is a signpost to what may happen. I know you got very excited about the business tax roadmap and how, I suppose, the administrative side of HMRC and how we design tax policy in particular for businesses, how that might be reformed during the Rachel Reeves tenure. And there was another bit of maybe positive signposting, because in the same breath around this advanced clearance process for major infrastructure projects, there was something similar for R&D projects as well, again, giving businesses a bit more certainty. And I like the idea, actually, that you could go to HMRC, pay a fee to cover that cost, as long as you are going to get more certainty around what your tax position will be. Because I think from working in the tax world for now over 20 years and listening to actually what other jurisdictions do, I happened to be sat next to an Italian tax advisor at breakfast this morning. That's what I do. It's the circles I mingle in. And he was saying, well, the Italian non-dom regime, you can get actually quite strong certainty around your tax position, which again is a big attraction to the regime for wealthy individuals. And I wonder, again, whether HMRC, the government, are thinking about that certainty, but certainly for businesses as well, because the cost of doing business, the compliance aspect, the cost of actually dealing with HMRC and tax inquiries on significant spend and what the tax position may be, that all creates an uncertain environment. So I think this is a step in the right direction. What is also traditional, I know this wasn't a fiscal event, but what is traditional now when any Chancellor stands up is more money for HMRC to tackle tax evasion and avoidance. And there was another 300 million I added up in the spring statement green book that's going over to HMRC. And if my numbers are right, I think that's now 1.7 billion of funding over the last 3 or 4 years for HMRC. That's a huge amount. And again, a few numbers that crossed my mind when I heard Rachel Reeves say there's more funding for HMRC. They were talking last year about 6.5 billion that they were going to raise through tackling tax avoidance and evasion. This is another billion on top of that. 5,000 new HMRC officers, another 500 to add to that this time round, and 600 debt collectors. But you're only going to generate an additional billion in 5 years' time. I'm a little bit underwhelmed by that, and the tax gap in absolute terms is higher than it's ever been before. But was there anything new in terms of tax evasion and avoidance? It feels like a repeat of what we've seen before, Heather.
That 1 billion felt to me very much like she needed £1 billion to make her numbers add up. So let's get it from avoidance and evasion, because frankly, you'll never prove whether they've managed to raise that amount from tackling avoidance and evasion. It's always a very difficult number to prove. Yes, of course, it's a good thing. I hope that some of the money going into HMRC is also going into systems improvement, because I think the better they can get their computer systems, the boring stuff of actually having good infrastructure to be able to administer the tax system is something that I think has been starved of investment over the last few years.
Yeah, I don't think the nuts and bolts are quite right. And we shouldn't forget that HMRC has had a really public bashing from the Public Accounts Committee, from the government very recently about its service standards, the fact it's not picking the phones up, waiting times, etc. And I do remain sceptical about how well some of this money is going to be spent. But I think you're right. I think they were just trying to make the numbers add up here to get to that budgetary number that they need to. This all takes us, I suppose, to what happens next. She said it was going to be one fiscal event a year. She's stood by that. But I kind of have alarm bells, Heather, about, well, what's going to happen in the autumn? Any suggestion from Rachel Reeves today as to what might happen in 6 months' time?
One point to note is that she's worked really hard to meet her fiscal goals, and that's fine provided everything stays the same, but it never does stay the same. She's going to have to go through a very tough spending review in June. The projected savings from changes to benefits are going to be really hard to deliver. I don't think she's going to be sitting there in the autumn saying, wow, everything's great now, I can do some giveaways. I think we're looking at certainly some form of tax raises in the autumn, and she hasn't got much room to manoeuvre because, of course, they've ruled out raising income tax, corporation tax, national insurance, VAT. It's going to be more fiddling around the edges, I think. And another important point to note is that the OBR's figures always assume that fuel duty is going to rise each year because it's in the legislation that it rises every year, except, of course, it doesn't. It hasn't risen now since 2011, and indeed it was cut about 3 years ago, and that so-called temporary cut wasn't reversed. So there's already a hole in the budget before she even starts making up any other ground. So I don't think it's going to be an easy budget in the autumn. I suppose the good news is that you and I can keep talking about all sorts of things for the next 6 months, Nimesh.
Yeah, I fear the wild speculation. If we get a repeat of last summer, that's not a good thing, because again, listening to Rachel Reeves' speech, and I had my head in my hands at one point that she referred again to the ill-fated mini budget from 2022. I felt like standing up and screaming, saying, Rachel, it was 2.5 years ago. And arguably, the autumn budget, which was only 6 months ago, and that speculation that I talked about, that actually caused more damage than I think we all realise. And we should also remember Jeremy Hunt reversed pretty much all of the mini budget within the space of a month or so. The same can't be said for farmers, family businesses, pensions, non-doms, national insurance. All of that is still a bit of a lag. And no one is talking about frozen allowances and thresholds anymore. We shouldn't forget that those are frozen until 2028. And the tax burden is still the highest it's been in 70 years, around 38% of GDP. I do think the country's going to run out of money come the autumn. That growth number doesn't fill me with any confidence. And what I'm struggling with is, where do you raise the money from? Are we going to get talk of CGT going up again, wealth taxes, exit taxes? Actually, you've hit upon a good point, Heather, that really we need to do something on fuel duty. That should have happened in the autumn budget. But is there anything else? If Rachel Reeves is listening to the Tax Factor, which I'm sure she does every week, and I'm sure she did in earnest before the spring statement, but what should she be doing and what should she be thinking about come the autumn budget?
I think she's got to address fuel duty sooner or later. I think it was a huge missed opportunity not putting it up at the budget last year. Petrol prices are still about 60 pence a litre less than they were when the 5p cut was brought in 2022. What else could she do? There's a lot of chat at the moment about a wealth tax. The snag with a wealth tax is that it's not a quick fix. Even if you could do it, and it would be complicated, it's probably about 3 years before it produces any money. So it's going to do very little in the life of this parliament. She's either going to have to go back on one of the manifesto promises, or there's going to have to be something new and exciting to look forward to.
I'm with you, Heather, that I think she needs to break the pensions triple lock. I'm not going to make any friends from pensioners by saying that. And also, I think she really needs to take a long, hard look at income tax, national insurance, VAT, less so corporation tax. But I think those three big taxes I don't think you've got a choice, but you're going to have to break your manifesto pledge. Those are the big levers to raise some much needed money. I think the tinkering around the edges, the autumn budget, and the wider damage that causes for business and entrepreneurship, I think that ship has sailed. We need to do something much bigger. And that pains me to say that, but I think that's the only option. And maybe there can be a bit of a giveaway to say, if we do increase, say, income tax by a penny or two on the headline rates, then maybe we can unlock the freezing of the allowances a bit sooner and make the books balance that way. But I'll be interested to talk to you on future episodes of The Tax Factor about what new and shiny things Rachel Reeves could do. So we are not going to be out of content, but one thing is we are almost out of time. And I can't believe we have actually managed to fill well over 10 minutes, Heather, talking about a pretty much non-event spring statement, which I am pleased was the case. But well done to you for taking us through that spring statement, and also some tips there for our Chancellor for the autumn budget.
The Tax Factor Spring Statement 2025.
That is all the time we now have for this special spring statement episode of The Tax Factor. As usual, our Blick Rothenberg website has a comprehensive collection of insights and analysis from our expert team, including our famous tax calculator. You can find all the links on our homepage, blickrothenberg.com.
If you'd like a break from budgets and statements, try our sister podcast, Brave Business. We've got a new episode out which takes a fascinating look at the topic of rapid scale-up businesses. Joining Declan Curry are Blick Rothenberg partner Stephanie Levin and guests Aidan Rushby, who is the founder and CEO of the car finance business Carmula, together with Mike Williams, co-founder of Jamaican patty manufacturer Flake Bake.
Two really interesting businesses, and you might remember Mike from the TV show Aldi's Next Big Thing, and indeed his Jamaican patties have become Aldi's big thing, as they've now sold over 1 million of them. It's great to have such guests and stories on Brave Business. As always, available on all major podcast platforms and the Blick Rothenberg website. Next week, Head of Private Client John Bull and Tax Factor regular Robert Salter are going to be providing more post-match analysis of the spring statement, if that's even possible. So tip for John and Robert, you might want to go and find some other stories, because I think we've done all we can for the spring statement. But on that note, it's goodbye from myself, and thank you for listening, and have a great weekend.
And it's goodbye from me, Heather Self, as well.
That's The Tax Factor. If you enjoyed The Tax Factor, please like, share and subscribe. Join us again next time on the UK's top tax podcast, The Tax Factor. The Tax Factor is a Blick Rothenberg production. Copyright 2025.